I'm finally there, Zora said into the phone on the dashboard as she brought her car to a stop and turned off the engine. I'm going to have a look around, and I'll call you back tonight after the first assessment. Have a good one. Bye. The call ended with a tap of her finger, and Zora let herself sink back into the comfy seat for another 15 seconds, calmly breathing in and out. 3 days. That's all she had to take a look at the old house and appraise its contents. What a joke. A few years ago, they would have given her a week at least. 20 years back, it would have been almost a month. But nowadays, with all the streamlined processes, the bandwidth optimizations, and the circle-back corporate jargon bullshit her bosses kept spouting, they had cut it down to almost nothing. Well, as Zora had informed them time and time again, it would lead to mistakes. There was no way anyone could go through a whole house, even if it was a small one, and accurately appraise its contents in such a time frame. But she would try. Another groan escaped her as she looked at her phone and the app showing her location. This house here really was cut off from everything. There were no neighbors around, no shops or even gas stations anywhere. The hotel she would be staying at was almost an hour away, which would cut into her time even more. It wasn't, in the strictest sense, allowed, but she would probably sleep inside the house, on a couch or something like that, to save herself some time and headaches. Zora left the car, locked it, and then fished the envelope out of her bag. She had 2 sets of keys, the ones the owner had had before he had died in the hospital. At least, this time, there wouldn't be any body-shaped stains on the flooring, she told herself to lighten her mood, but only managed to roll her eyes. Zora looked around once more. The area wasn't exactly what she would call beautiful, but it definitely was calm. There was hardly anything to look at. Some mountains far away, cornfields that would turn green again once spring hit, telephone poles, and a few trees that now looked dead and empty in the cold winter air. People who lived in places such as this either were recluses or on the run from someone, Zora thought with a scoff, then turned and looked more closely at the house. Its condition was dreadful. The small, formerly white fence surrounding the property was brown and grey, with only a few spots even hinting at its original colour. A mailbox stood, rusted from the rain next to the driveway. There were leaves and garbage on the overgrown lawn, and it didn't look like it had just accumulated these past few months either. Whoever the owner had been, he had neglected his property for years, Zora thought. There wouldn't be anything valuable to find here, her experience told her. She took a step and looked more closely at the mailbox. Even though it was weathered and rusty, Zora could make out some bright-colored letters that must have peeled off over the years. Turning around again, she finally concentrated on the main purpose for which she had come here. The building itself. It wasn't much better than the rest. The paint was flaking, the roof looked like it could cave in at any moment, and the windows were opaque from dirt and neglect. Maybe 3 days really would be enough, she told herself, felt a cold breeze and quickly walked across the lawn and toward the front entrance. At least she wouldn't have to look through more than the ground floor and maybe the attic, she promised herself. If she hurried up, she might even be able to finish early and spend the day at the hotel, relaxing a bit before her flight back home. Finally, at least a tiny smile returned to her lips as she pulled out the key and opened the front door of this dilapidated house. Dust blew into her face and made her cough as a musty smell greeted her. The smile vanished as quickly as it had appeared. Zora turned her head and watched as the cloud flew past her and got blown away by the cold wind. Maybe she had celebrated too early just now. She waited a few more seconds, then looked inside again. A sheen of dust covered the floor, with a single set of shoe prints leading out. No one had been here since the owner left. Great, she mumbled sarcastically. Well, it would make her job easier on the one hand, but harder on the other. Nothing would have been taken or stolen, but then again, no one had bothered to clean up this place either. Maybe she should have asked to see the hospital's report after all. The shoe prints meant that the owner had left his home that last time on his own 2 feet at least, but the dust surrounding everything made her skin crawl. What if he had been a hoarder? That would really mess with her plans. Her company would need to send in someone else to clean up first, which would mean her stay here might turn into a weeks-long project. Zora hated the idea. Spending 3 days here was bad enough. There was nothing to do for her besides work. She was far away from her partner, her family, her friends. If she had known it would turn out like that, she would have prepared differently. After blinking the dust out of her eyes, she looked again, this time more closely at the small empty room. It was almost empty. A shoe rack, 3 hooks holding up 2 jackets, a small table with a bowl on top for the keys. She felt hope again and smelled the air. There was no stench of rot or anything like that coming from deeper inside. Yes, the dust might be a problem, but she could air out the house and get rid of it herself. As long as there were no mountains of trash or stuff like that, she'd be fine. Zora finally stepped inside, flicked on the light, and closed the door behind her. It fell shut with a bang that seemed to echo back from the walls. At least the light still worked, she thought, then turned around once to fully take in the room. There was a small mirror close to the entrance, and 5 letters painted on the inside of the door. It gave her the creeps. "Smile," it said, big and red. What had she gotten herself into? The colors were still vivid, the letters hadn't run or started flaking off. It couldn't be older than a few months. Why would anyone paint something like that on the inside of one's door? It felt less friendly and more threatening to her. Zora shook her head, kept her jacket on, and started moving. The first thing she had to do was a simple walkthrough. She could take mental notes on what she could see at a glance, make out which rooms looked promising, and spot potential hazards. Stuff like that would make her initial report stand out a bit more, her boss had once told her. She left the anteroom and walked on. In the back of her mind, Zora still dreaded stumbling upon a room the former owner had used for hoarding, but her fears turned out to be unfounded. Zora got to the living room, which only had a bookshelf, a small rundown couch, and an ancient-looking TV. It wasn't mounted to a wall, but was standing on a rack that had to support its massive weight. The thing was worthless, Zora immediately thought. Not an LCD screen, but one of those old CRT ones. She got closer to it, touched it, and realized that even though the floor here was covered in dust as well, there was hardly a single speck on it. Someone had taken great care in keeping this thing working. It had to be at least 2 decades old, right? Worthless, she repeated in her mind, then stopped herself. Maybe there were collectors for those things. It looked great and would probably weigh as much as her, but there had to be people out there willing to pay a premium in shipping costs to get one, right? Zora made a mental note, then looked down at the rack it was standing on. A giant black VCR stood on one of the shelves. She bit her lip. So, the thing didn't even have a DVD or Blu-ray player, but still used a VCR? She'd definitely put that into her report. Someone else would know what to do with that. Zora turned away and walked to the kitchen. That room, as well, was pretty much the complete opposite of her fears. She opened the cupboards and found 1 glass, 2 plates, and single items of flatware. 1 pot, 1 pan, an old microwave. It wasn't worth much or anything at all, but at least she didn't have to contend with mountains of old newspapers or stuff like that. She closed the cupboards back up and walked out of the kitchen again and back into the living room. The couch looked at least 20 years old as well, she thought, the second time she passed it. But it would do as a temporary bed for her. She could sleep in this room and work through the whole house in maybe 48 hours, if she was lucky. Well, if the rest was like the rooms here, she might be done by nightfall. Zora walked on, found the bathroom, which was almost completely empty, and then the bedroom, where she saw a single wardrobe and a bed. Neither of those pieces of furniture looked especially well made or durable. They'd probably end up being given away, so the company wouldn't have to pay to throw them into the landfill. It was inside the wardrobe that Zora finally found something that seemed completely opposite to the Spartan conditions of the house. Next to a single sweatshirt, pants, and socks, she discovered 5 different suits, 5 bow ties, and shirts with matching colors. Still not worth anything, but at least she had found something that stuck out. The man who had lived here must have been a strange creature. Zora looked around. There were no pictures on the walls, no kind of decoration. He had lived alone for God knows how long, completely cut off from everyone as far as she could see. "Smile," she mumbled as she left the room behind. The word on the inside of the front door. Had he hated leaving this place so much that he had to remind himself to not let it show? She couldn't believe it. People who like to live like that at least decorated their houses, right? This place didn't feel like a home at all. Zora looked at the ceiling of the bedroom and spotted a small hatch in the corner. The attic. No. First she needed to get through this floor. There were still 2 doors left. Leaving the bedroom behind, she walked back to the small hallway. 2 doors. One would probably be a supply closet, Zora thought, and opened the first and found that she had been correct. An old vacuum cleaner, a mop, and a shelf with different plastic bottles on it. Another room with nothing of value, she thought. By now, Zora was pretty sure that this place would turn out to be a complete bust. The man had neither money, nor family, nor friends. No one had come forward to try to claim anything from his estate. He had existed in this house and had spent his days alone and ignored by the world at large. In all likelihood, there would be no one left to think of him after she was done checking out this place. he would be forgotten. Zora shook her head to get rid of these thoughts, closed the supply closet and walked over to the other door. What kind of room could still be left in here? She flicked the light switch next to the door, opened it, and then furrowed her brow. In front of her were stairs leading down into a basement. Zora thought back to the file she had gotten about the house. There had been no mention of a basement at all. A new smell came up from the level below. A stinging one. Zora breathed in and turned her head away. Paint and solvents, she thought. Well, someone must have missed that part of the house in the file, but at least it felt a bit different. Maybe she would be able to find something worthwhile down there. Descending the rickety wooden steps, Zora felt the atmosphere changing. The first floor hadn't been warm or comfortable at all, but the air down here seemed almost freezing. Maybe the owner had left a window open? If that were the case, the value of stuff down there would have diminished considerably. There was nothing worse than cold wind or humid conditions. Plaster wall separated the stairs from the real basement, but Zora could already see the door at the bottom of the steps standing open a crack. The smell was definitely coming from down there. She sped up, heard the wood creaking beneath the soles of her shoes, and was glad she had decided to stay in her winter clothing, even inside this house. A low moan came from the hinges of the door as she pushed the entrance open and, for the first time that day, found a room that looked like someone had spent time in it. There were decorations on the walls, printed out pictures and framed newspapers, hooks with wigs big and small, shelves with paint and tools, and in the corner, a workbench. The floor down here was dust-free, and the more Zora looked, the more details stuck out to her. A name that seemed to pop up everywhere. Ferdinand the Fabulous. Zora scoffed, then shook her head and got closer to the framed newspapers hanging on the wall. They were decades old, but in them, she could see pictures of a man holding a doll. She recognized the suit-shirt combo of his instantly. It was the same she had seen up there in the closet. Fabulous Ferdinand visits the children's hospital, one caption beneath the picture said. Ferdinand the Fabulous, local TV star at his first national talk show. Zora didn't recognize the set or the presenter standing next to the man. It must have been some kind of short-lived variety act thing, she thought. She walked on and looked at the newspaper clippings. The man got older, the headlines less friendly. Ferdinand the Fabulous announces tour. Ferdinand the Fabulous only tonight at the Overlook Hotel. The clippings stopped showing pictures, and the font of the headlines got smaller and smaller. Where are they now? Ferdinand the Fabulous met us for an interview. Zora bit her lip. A D-list local star who never quite made it. No one would crow about his memorabilia. The room would probably be a bust as well. She looked across again. A banner hung on the wall above the workbench. Ferdinand the Fabulous, it said in big letters. And his 5 fun friends stood below in a smaller font. Zora felt a shiver in the air as she read those words. She looked back at the workbench. Would this thing be worth anything? It seemed nice, at least, and would be decades old as well. But hardly anyone would pay more for a used workbench than a new one. She walked toward it and let her fingers brush over the rough plate. It was truly well worn. The man must have spent hundreds of hours here, creating something. Zora looked across and could see a single framed picture mounted at eye height for someone sitting at the bench. It was the man in the suit with 5 dolls in his arms. Their dead wooden faces all looked like they were smiling, but the glass eyes staring out of the picture spoke of a completely different truth. They looked strange, and not just the dolls themselves, no. The man holding them wasn't any better. He was already balding. Hard lines marked his face, and there were bags under his eyes. But he was grinning from ear to ear. The photo must have been taken in the later years of his life, long after any national talk show. Zora reached out, and her fingers brushed grooves that seemed far more deliberate than the rest. She stopped and stared. 3 words were carved into the wood of the workbench, right in its center. Don't give up. There was a lump in her throat. She could feel the anguish of the man forcing himself to keep going. This was just sad, Zora thought, and turned away. She looked at the shelf next to the workbench and saw 6 boxes in it, amongst the other tools. Zora pulled out the first one. Its lid was labeled fan mail. But the moment she had grabbed it, she had felt that it was very, very light. Zora opened it and found a single piece of paper in there. A note written in the same style as the label on the lid. "You're doing great," it said. She closed the box quickly and put it back where she had found it. Completely worthless, Zora thought again while she shook her head. Some part of her wondered why the man had left his house at all on that last day. He must have been horribly depressed. She took out the next box and immediately realized that it was far heavier. The cardboard moved as she lifted it up, and the lid showed the name Tammy in big red letters. Zora put it on the workbench so as to not accidentally drop it, opened it, and found a wooden box inside the cardboard one. That box actually looked like it could be worth something. Dark, polished wood glimmered in the light of the basement, and as soon as she found the clasp, the container opened up with hardly a noise. Zora smelled an unpleasant scent as she stared down at a ventriloquist dummy with an oddly dead-looking face and the strangest eyes she had ever seen. They seemed somehow alive. She shuddered involuntarily, closed the box back up quickly, and put it back where she had found it. Maybe someone would be willing to pay money for such a thing. It had been on TV, after all. She couldn't help but feel a chill, standing there and looked around. There was no window down here and no draft, her mind warned. Then why was it this cold? Well, that wasn't her problem, Zora reminded herself. She was here to catalog and list everything of value. Her fingers were shaking as she stood there. Pulling out her phone, she looked at the clock. Not much time had passed, but she had already walked through pretty much every part of the house. Maybe it was time for her to take a break. She did deserve it. Zora sighed and made a mental note of the 5 boxes. Those could be worth something, she reiterated in her mind, then turned around and quickly walked back up the stairs. It was strange. Only once she reached the first floor did this oppressive atmosphere lessen. She realized how flat her breathing had become down there, how quick her heart beat. It was as if she had been afraid, even though she couldn't say why. Her feet moved her through the house and back into the living room. She wanted to take a quick break, sit down, and let this tension subside. There wasn't nearly as much to do as she had feared. As long as the attic wasn't chock full of strange antiquities, she'd be done by tomorrow, with or without a break. Zoe reached the couch, sat down, and then stood up again. At least she had a TV, she thought, even though she wasn't sure what kind of channels were available to her. There was no remote, which meant she had to get up to turn it on or change the volume. Zora sighed again, found the button to turn the TV on, and immediately felt the static electricity emanating from the screen. It felt strange seeing such a thing come alive today, almost like looking back into the past. The picture slowly appeared, just black and white static. Zora flicked through the channels with a button on the side. Every single one showed the exact same thing. She groaned, then hit the TV's top with the palm of her hand. The screen flickered, went dark, then suddenly got clear. Colors began to show on the TV as a studio set came into view. But there was no sound. She pressed the buttons on the side of the bulky thing, but nothing changed. Well, what did she expect? At least seeing the picture was something, Zora thought, and moved back until she touched the couch again. On the TV, the man in the suit came out, and the people were applauding. He was young, almost handsome, but the dummy on his arm looked different. It was the same she had seen down in the basement. Tammy, Zora thought, then saw that she was correct as the words, "Fabulous Ferdinand with Tammy," flashed on the screen. But something was off about her. She watched as the man shook hands with the host and sat down and started talking. Zora could see his lips moving whenever the dummy began to open its mouth. He really hadn't been that talented. But the people seemingly didn't mind. They applauded, laughed, and showed their joy. The puppet was different. Part of her piped up. Its eyes were just glass. Zora felt herself getting tired. The tension was finally subsiding. On the screen, the picture changed. It now showed the man with the suit sitting in front of a crowd of children, a different dummy on his hand. They were laughing as well, but some also stared at him with a look of disappointment. Zora suddenly felt tired. The scenes changed, and with every single reappearance, the man got older and the crowd smaller and less interested. Through half-closed eyes, Zora still noticed him moving his lips whenever his dummies talked, and now the audience was clearly aware as well. The man seemed on the verge of a breakdown. Zora blinked, and suddenly the whole room changed. She wasn't on the couch anymore, but was standing in the basement next to a hunched-over figure at the workbench. He had a chisel in his hand and was scratching something into the wood. Zora didn't have to look to see what. Don't give up. She had seen it down there. The chisel slipped and stabbed the man in the hand, who shot up with a silent scream. Blood was running down his arm, dripping onto the workbench and filling out the words. The light above flickered, and suddenly the man wasn't alone in the room anymore. A figure appeared behind him and put two shadowy hands on his shoulders. Zora couldn't hear them, but saw the man weeping without turning around, the blood still running down his arm and pooling on the floor. An inhuman voice finally broke through the silence.
1 piece per doll.
It was a command. She felt it deep inside of her, and the man did so too. Zora watched in horror as the shadowy figure disappeared, and the man grabbed hold of the chisel again, putting his still bleeding hand flat on the workbench. "Don't!" she screamed, as she saw him lifting up the tool. The tip glimmered red in the light as it rushed down toward his hand. Zora turned her head away to not look, then heard the soft, sickening crunch, and as she opened her eyes again, she was sitting on the couch, watching the TV. The sound was on. People were cheering as a man sat in front of them, a doll on his lap. Zora almost froze as she heard the voice coming from the dummy. It wasn't his voice at all anymore. The man's mouth stayed completely closed. Nothing in his throat moved as the doll started to laugh, sing, and talk. She felt a chill again, deep in her bones. The crowd looked amazed, but the cheering was off. It was more of a polite applause than the reaction she had seen at his first talk show appearance. Or was it just a time? A decade must have passed at least. Tastes had changed, right? Or could they feel it just like she did? That something was wrong here, that the puppet was different, not inanimate. Zora noticed a sad smile on the man's face. He knew it as well. Had he struck a deal with some demon, only to find out that he had come too late? The dummy on his lap was still talking on, but the man's eyes were focused directly at the camera. It looked like he was staring out at her, sizing her up. Zora felt a chill and had to stifle a scream as the TV screen suddenly turned off and she saw herself in the black surface, sitting on the couch. The only problem was that she wasn't alone anymore. Behind the sofa, something was moving. A silhouette, wearing a suit, bending over until its face was only a hand's breadth away from the top of her head. Zora screamed and jumped forward, turning around before she even hit the ground. The figure was gone. She tried to catch her breath, but froze suddenly. A heavy cardboard box hit the floor down below in the basement. Zora could almost feel it. A second box followed, then a third. She jumped up. Grabbing her bag, she pulled out the pepper spray and her phone, then started walking. As long as she was in here, any damage to the contents of the property had to be logged. If someone had come in, she would call the police. The door to the basement was still standing open, and Zora thought she could hear something through it. Someone was moving down there. Zora took a deep breath, then rushed forward and descended the stairs. 2 more boxes fell. The thuds echoed around her. She sped up, jumped down the last stairs, and then rushed into the room, ready to shout. 5 boxes were lying on the floor, but no one was there. She looked from corner to corner. The windowless basement was empty. Zora concentrated on the fallen boxes again. The wooden ones were open. She could see their lids, and from one, half a carved face was sticking out. What unnerved her more was the eye that stared at her from there. It was glass, she told herself, but all her instincts screamed at her that that wasn't true at all. This thing looking at her was alive. She felt a new, even colder chill, then cried out as something shot toward her. Her finger pressed the release on the pepper spray, and a cloud came out just as the small object hit the wall right next to her face. Shards of glass hit her cheek as the frame exploded, and for a single instant, time seemed to stop. Zora noticed all those details in that one moment. Someone had thrown the framed picture from the workbench at her. The man in the photo was smiling. No, grinning. He held the dolls with his left lower arm, but his hand was strange. It was almost a stump, 5 fingers missing. 5 puppets staring out at her. A stinging pierced through her heart as time suddenly resumed and the debris clattered over the floor. Zora smelled the acrid stench of the pepper spray, whirled around and ran up the stairs. Every instinct in her body told her to run. There was a presence down there, one that definitely wasn't human. She reached the top of the steps, turned and raced toward the living room, while her hand already dialed the emergency numbers into her phone. Zora had no idea how she would explain herself to them, but it didn't matter right now. Her life was in danger. She rounded the last corner, jumped into the living room, and then suddenly froze. Someone was sitting on the couch. A ventriloquist dummy, and behind it, the shadowy figure of a man in a suit. Zora turned on her heel and ran toward the front door. She prayed in her mind that it would open as she heard something hitting the floor behind her. Without slowing down, she reached the door, ripped it open, and jumped out into the cold evening breeze. The keys to her car were still in her pocket. She raced toward it, ignored the sound of small footsteps coming after her, pulled open the door of her vehicle, and jumped in. Zora started the engine, threw the car in reverse, and began peeling out of the driveway, her tires spraying loose gravel all over the place. In the open door, she could see it. A small figure, standing and staring at her with those strangely alive eyes, while behind it, a shadow seemed to kneel. She wanted to scream, but didn't dare. Her car stopped for a moment before she hit the gas and shot forward. With her heart beating out of control and the fear still clouding her mind, she couldn't concentrate on anything but racing off. That house was cursed. She needed to inform someone. Zora felt the phone in her hand, looked down, and saw the numbers still on display. She pressed a button on the screen to call the emergency services, and then screamed. Her eyes had wandered to the rearview mirror, where they met someone else's. There, on the back seat, sat a figure. Its carved wooden face was completely lifeless, but the eyes that stared at her were not. In a panic, Zora's hand gripped the steering wheel to the side. She felt the front of the car lurching and the back sliding. She tried correcting it, but her eyes couldn't look away from the thing staring at her through the mirror. With a bang, the side of her vehicle crashed into a tree, and the whole world turned into a mess of flying shards of glass and bending metal around her. Zora came to, and the first thing she felt was the searing pain in her head. Her left arm was numb, the side of her face burned, and the world seemed to be spinning around her. Somewhere in the half-darkness of the overturned car, a voice tried to talk to her. Her phone. She couldn't see it right now. The call had gone through. Please, help me, she whispered, her throat feeling rough. Another wave of pain flooded her body as blood continued trickling from the wound on her head. It reminded her of something. Zora cried out as she tried to push herself up, then collapsed again, and her scream turned into a whimper. There, maybe an arm's length away, she could see something in the darkness. A figure, small and carved from wood. Its suit, formerly immaculate, was torn, its head broken. Zora smelled it now as well, the stench of rot. The small lamp inside the car started to flicker, and she could see the source of the smell. A A finger, a human one, dried out and mummified, was sticking out of the broken doll's head. She wanted to scream again, but her instincts warned her not to move a single muscle. The dummy's eyes were still alive, and now they began to roll in their sockets.